Welcome back to the Cat Center's public programs, where today we are closing out our three-part series on critical race studies and Jewish history. I'm Ann Albert, the Cat Center's CLAT Family Director for Public Programs. And on behalf of our director, Steve Weitzman, and Associate Director, Natalie Dorman, I sincerely thank you for joining us. Just a few words while people filter in and before I introduce our speaker. First, my thanks to my colleagues who make everything go behind the scenes here at the Cat Center, Diana, Dennis Walters, Brian Lipscomb, and Becky Friedman. And as always, to the donors who support this programming, especially the Klatt family, the Harry Stern Family Foundation, and the Friends of the Cat Center, which is a group that has come together to support especially this kind of programming. If you're interested in finding out more information about that group and contributing to support us, we welcome you to follow the link in the chat. I also need to point you to the Cat Center's YouTube channel, where we have archived most of our public programs from the past couple of years, including last spring's series on Jews, race, and religion, which is obviously thematically connected with this one, as well as our programming from earlier this year. I'll also just give a quick heads up about future programs. So 2 weeks from today, we'll have a panel discussion on ways that the concepts of community and continuity have been defined by scholars on one hand and by Jews and Jewish institutions on the other, and how those arenas intersect around these two ways of understanding belonging. It's a great lineup of 4 scholars who think really big about these issues. So I invite you to join us for that. After that program, we will adjourn until January. Everybody will enjoy a little break, and we'll take back up at that point our series on the origin of canonical Jewish legal works. So this is the Canon in Context series that started earlier this fall. And the first lecture in that series in the spring will be given by Professor Yves Krakowski of Princeton University on Maimonides' Mishneh Torah. We do have a full lineup for the spring semester. That's really exciting, and we'll be announcing some programs that aren't yet online. We'll be announcing it in another couple of weeks. So do watch for info about them by email or on social media. As usual today, we'll proceed in the following way. I'll introduce our speaker. She'll speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll have a nice period of time for Q&A. I will be moderating Q&A from the questions that are submitted via the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And I'll just say that you are very welcome to post questions at any time during the talk. And I will do my best to get at least the main ideas of most of the questions across to our speaker. Now, to today. This is, as I said, the final session in a kind of trilogy of talks looking at the ways in which thinking about race is useful for or illuminated by thinking about Jewish history. So the series is by no means exhaustive, but our set of 3 talks has addressed medieval Europe, the early modern Atlantic world, and now the modern US. So the talks take 3 deep dives into particular contexts where the approaches and insights of race studies intersect with Jewish studies and particularly with Jewish historical experience. There's, of course, a lot more to be said than what we've been able to cover in this short series, and we do hope to continue this work in future programming. So today, we're very, very lucky to have with us Dr. Sarah Imhoff from Indiana University, Bloomington. Sarah's research is really wide-ranging, but a common thread of it is the relationship between religion and the body. She asks questions about how bodies and their attributes, including gender and race, and also ability, have shaped and are shaped by religion. So her first book, called Masculinity and the Making of American Judaism, treated the gender norms of American Jewish men in the first half of the 20th century, which were different from gender norms among other American men. She's also interested in the meaning of Jewishness in historical and contemporary American contexts, especially the ways race, DNA, and medical knowledge shape what it means to be Jewish or who is a Jew, And in that vein, you might be interested in checking out a recent publication. She published an essay called Racial Standing: How American Jews Imagine Community and Why That Matters. And I think you'll hear perhaps an echo of the panel that we have planned for a couple of weeks from now in that title. And that's in a book that came out last year from Penn State University Press called Judaism, Race, and Ethics: Conversations and Questions. Sarah will be introducing us today to ways of thinking about how Jews have fit into the racial landscape of the US in the early 20th century and in the early 21st. So Sarah, welcome.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Anne and Diana, for facilitating this and making all of this so easy. In an era of Zoom, sometimes I feel like technology gets in our way more than it helps, but you've been both really excellent with organizing everything, and I'm so glad to be able to virtually join you. So I will jump right in. I'm going to share some slides here so you don't just have to look at my face for 40 minutes. Are Jews white? I have observed a version of this conversation, I think, more times than I can count now. Because of the pandemic, I've seen a lot of it online lately, but I know it takes place in person too. The basic disagreement is over Jews and race. It begins something like this. One person says, well, Jews aren't white because they're different. Jews are a minority. Did you not see what happened in Charlottesville? White nationalists hate Jews. And sometimes this person also calls for additional protections for Jews, usually in political or legal forms. But then the other person says, but most Jews are white, and as white people, they've benefited from these systems of racial hierarchy. How can you not see that? These are some headlines from some reputable places. Just in case you wondered if it was just my social media feed or yours, it's not. There are lots of reasons underlying this conversational conflict, and some of them have to do with antagonistic and polarized Republican versus Democrat politics. Some of them have to do with Israel, and some of them have to do with the fact that questions about Jews and race in the US are not simple. Not historically, and not now. It's this last piece that I want to talk about today. How do Jews fit in the racial landscape in the US? And how did it get that way? So if you've been coming to these talks so far, you might have some inkling of the far past. And today I'll talk about the slightly more recent past. Although a substantial number of scholarly books and articles discuss how Jews became white in the US, they often talk about when that happened. Was it the early 20th century? Was it the middle of the 20th century? I actually don't think that's a useful formulation. First, some Jews have never been white. There are Black Jews and Asian Jews and multiracial Jews, and that's not new. And second, and perhaps less obviously, even Ashkenazi and Sephardi Jews who traced their lineage back to Europe, when they settled in the Atlantic, colonies, actually, I'm thinking of the British colonies, but all of them, they were counted as white very early on. They could own slaves, but they could not be enslaved. Not in a single colony in the early Republic. Yes, they experienced discrimination on account of their religion, but people, Jewish, Christian, and others, assumed that when Congress passed a statute in 1790, so this is very early Republic, limiting naturalization to free white persons, everybody assumed it included Jews. No one even questioned whether Jews were covered under free white persons. European descent Jews then were white from the founding of the US. So it seems weird, if not straight up misleading, from a historical perspective to say that Jews only became white in the 20th century. However, just because how Jews became white is not a very useful way to talk about what happened with Jews and race in the 20th century doesn't mean that the scholars who talk about it are just mistaken about the way Jews have experienced racialized othering. Put another way, these historians are right to show that Jews really have experienced racism. Today, I'll talk about two moments in the history of American Jews. One is the early 20th century, and the other is our contemporary moment. And we'll see some differences, of course, but we'll also see some surprising similarities. I'll also give away the ending at the beginning. My main point here in both contexts is to demonstrate something that might seem unintuitive, that Jews can both be white and experience racialized anti-Semitism. So here I'll start with the early 20th century. It was a formative time for both US conversations about race and for American Jews. About 2 million Jews came into the US between 1880 and 1924. Established American Jewish communities were outnumbered by these new immigrants, but they held more financial and social capital, and they often tried to mold the new immigrants in their image, an image that they saw as modern and American and with exemplary morals and religious views. Of course, they thought of themselves quite highly. The US more generally plunged itself into conversations about the physical and social characteristics of different races and ideological questions about which of these races should make up the nation. In the late 19th and early 20th century, Jews in the US were religiously a minority, but they were racially white. Or were they? There was no doubt that the practice of Judaism was part of what made Jews different from their white neighbors. But racial difference also haunted American Jewishness. And here I don't mean the Jews who weren't white. There were, of course, Black Jews at this time. There were Sephardi Jews who might not have been considered white. But even the Jews who were from Eastern Europe or had entirely European background had a complicated relationship with race. Muckraking journalists and reformers pointed to the Jewish race as the main operatives in the white slave trade, which I'll talk more about later, but it's a sensationalized phrase for organized prostitution of white women. So how could Jews be a despised race, but also be included in the category of white? Nativists didn't hesitate to refer to other immigrant groups with slurs that marked them as non-white. So Jean Turner Zimmerman wrote White or Yellow, a story of America's great white slave trade with Asia. And Ernest Bell's book repeatedly referred to the yellow slave trade to smear Asian Americans for their supposed promotion of prostitution. These authors emphasized that their subjects were not white. And so it's clear that they understood white slavery as having specifically racial reference. But Jews didn't face these off-color slurs. When Jewish men and women were implicated as white slavers, and when Jewish men were implicated as white slavers and Jewish women were accused of being prostitutes, even nativists and xenophobes rarely contested the implication that Jews were white. These same nativists and xenophobes, however, saw Jews as racially and religiously other. One pastor complained they were, quote, too bigoted to surrender any racial traditions, by which he actually seemed to mean religious ones. These conversations about prostitution, which I'll get into a little more in depth later, highlight two apparent paradoxes. First, that Jewishness functions simultaneously as a racial classification and as a religious classification. And second, that Jews could simultaneously be white and racially other. To explore these paradoxes, today I'm going to look at the public conversations about Jews, sex, and prostitution. I'll look at other things too, but it's nice to have a focus. Unlike African American men, who were feared to have excessive and aggressive sexuality, Jewish men were alternately praised and derided for their gentleness, which it seemed could also be linked to perversion. Jewish women were both praised for their mothering and criticized for their aggressive and manly participation in radical politics. Jews of both sexes were accused of participating in organized prostitution, which implied abnormal and immoral sexuality. So when both Jews and non-Jews discussed what it meant to be Jewish, though these voices often disagreed about the content or the characteristics of this, most of them agreed that Jewish gender and sexuality were not identical to normative white gender and sexuality. At once racially other and one of the white races, both Jewish men and women together appeared in the public eye as outsiders, but who also showed these signs of being a model minority if we think about discourse from later in the century. So how could Jews be white but also experience racialization? Most Americans of this period, both Jewish and non, saw humankind as made up of many races, including, and this is quite different from today, multiple white races. Like non-white races, these races each had their individual characteristics, which people deemed superior or inferior. In short, some of the white races were better than the other white races. Because of this, Jews could be a white race without being the normative white race, or they could be a white race while still being a somewhat inferior one. Even when writers, and here I'm thinking about journalists, but also some ethnographers and scientists, even when they did exclude Jews from the white races, the sources still tended to uphold the idea that there were multiple unequal white races. So Lothrop Stoddard, author of The Rising Tide of Color Against White Supremacy, explained the white race divides into three main subspecies: the Nordics, the Alpines, and the Mediterraneans. All three are good stocks, ranking in genetic worth well above the various colored races. However, there seems to be no question that the Nordic is far and away the most valuable type, standing indeed at the head of the whole human genus. Stoddard, a Harvard PhD, also quoted the notorious racist Madison Grant, who bemoaned the passing of the great race in a book of that title. The great race, he identified, was the Nordic race, one of the white races, but never in any of these men's schemes was it the sole white race. These men, both of them, expressed anti-Semitic sentiment, and Stoddard suggested Jews might be Asiatic, and yet they contributed to a racial landscape in which others could fit Jews into an overarching category of whiteness, usually, because lesser subspecies, which sometimes gets used as a phrase, of whiteness were still racially inferior. Part of the evidence for racial difference, and particularly racial hierarchy, came from science. That science included measuring people's skulls and looking at the shape of their faces. I think it's important to say that these measurements and diagrams are, well, what's the technical term? Hogwash. They're almost laughable to us. We'd laugh out loud if we saw this as evidence on even the most far-fetched crime drama series on TV or Netflix, right? But phrenology, that's the study of the cranium, and physiognomy, that's the study of like facial features and ears and things like that, as indicative of personality and intelligence and other things. Both of these things were really science at the time. We have this temptation when we talk about them to call them pseudoscience, because now that's how we think of them, and we know that they're not valid. But the fact is, this is kind of the way science works. Old ideas are revised with new data, and they were science at the time. Phrenologists reported what they discovered from the shape of people's heads. And it's also worth saying here that this kind of science, phrenology, physiognomy, and related eugenic sciences, were used to make statements about the suitability of different immigrant groups to the US. Famous scientific studies link the size and shapes of people's skulls to how civilized each racial or ethnic group was, and how well suited they were into integration into American society. In general, Jews fared fairly well in these rankings, often alongside groups like Italians, and almost always ranking higher than Asians and so-called Negroes at the time. These sorts of scientific images of heads and skulls then wouldn't have seemed weird to an American public. The public, like the scientific practitioners themselves, saw them as science. But it wasn't just non-Jews who talked about Jews as a race. Jews discussed it too. For example, a 1911 report, there we go. For a 1911 report, a US Immigration Commission wrote to Jewish communal leaders and asked those leaders, are Jews a race? The very fact that most of the communal leaders they picked were rabbis also shows you that as they're writing, they're imagining Jewishness as religion. Yes, Jews are a race, said Rabbi Kaufman Kohler. Quote, ethnologically, Jews certainly represent a race, since both their religion and history ever kept them apart from the rest of the people of the country they inhabit. No, said Cyrus Adler, a scholar of ancient Judaism and then president of his large Philadelphia synagogue. Assuming for the moment that a race is an ethnical stock, he said, a great division of mankind having in common certain distinguishing physical peculiarities, appealing to be derived from a distinct primitive source, I should say that in this sense, Jews were not, strictly speaking, a race. Morris Jastrow, he didn't say no or yes. Instead, he said, in some ways, Jews are a race. In my opinion, the Jew represents neither a nation nor a race in a political sense, but he does represent a race for anthropological and sociological purposes. All three of these men and the others who replied to the commission's questions agreed that Jewishness was religiously distinctive, but they never reached anything like a consensus about race. Kohler, Adler, and Jastrow represented common positions within the Jewish community. Race could be a useful way to talk about Jewishness, but others worried too much race talk might emphasize otherness. Understanding Jewish race then is partly about understanding whiteness, but also partly about understanding the way Jews were racialized in this shifting field of race, where even Jews disagreed amongst themselves whether there was a Jewish race and what its characteristics might be. Even being classified as white was not sufficient to mean racially normative or desirable. This complex landscape of racial constructions also suggests how Jewish women could be seen as both bomb-throwing Bolsheviks and excellent mothers, and Jewish men could be both simultaneously gentle and sexually deviant, which is a great segue into our discussion of white slavery. Sometimes lauded for their willingness to assimilate or zeal for education, and sometimes demeaned for their pushiness, Jews had a mixed reputation in the press. On the one hand, most Americans thought that the Jewish race was not prone to alcohol or syphilis, problems that were signs of masculine vice and sexual vice, respectively. A doctor wrote to New Era magazine to say that Jews were not, in fact, immune to consumption, as the magazine had suggested, but rather, he credited, quote, the great care which the poor Jewish mother bestows upon her children, the pronounced home life, characteristic sobriety, the unusually good and well-prepared food. So this is a nod to both good womanhood and maybe perhaps the religious practice of keeping kosher, but it's not totally clear. Elsewhere, others also attributed these values to the practice of a scientifically sound Judaism. These images often differentiated Jewish women from the women of other immigrant groups, such as Irish women, whom some considered bad mothers. On the other hand, when it came to crime reporting, both daily newspapers and national monthlies tended toward the negative. So these portrayals often insinuated that Jewish women's sexuality could be properly oriented around motherhood, but it could also be disorderly. And sometimes it could even be both. The most common public occasion to discuss the gender and sexuality of Jewish women were concerns about the problem of prostitution, or, in the terms of the time, white slavery. The very phrase white slavery implies that white people couldn't possibly be chattel slaves, as Black Americans had been. If white people were enslaved, it must be something different. People in the US and Britain occasionally use the phrase to mean things such as wage slavery, but prostitution was its main referent. Including Jews in white slavery rhetoric, indeed, making them the center of the conversation as they sometimes were, reinforced the idea that Jews were white people. Nevertheless, this association with whiteness existed right alongside blaming Jewish men and women for prostitution, a rhetorical move that contributed to this idea that they were not quite the same gender and sexuality wise. In 1909, the journalist George Kibbe Turner wrote an expose in McClure's magazine. Unlike the articles of most of his fellow muckrakers, Turner's reporting had a nativist bent, which painted immigrants in general, and Jews in particular, as a political scourge. Perpetuating anti-Semitic stereotypes, Turner explained that Jewish boys were continuing the racial tradition of money obsession and deception, and Jewish girls were continuing the tradition of sexual deviance. He wrote, "The largest regular business in furnishing women, however, is done by a company of men, largely composed of Russian Jews, who supply women of that nationality to the trade. Male pimps demonstrated their own disorderly sexuality and the errant sexuality of the Jewish women they managed." Unlike regional readership of newspapers, people across the nation subscribed to the widely popular McClure's and slowly paged through its long-form journalism, serialized fiction, and other feature-length things. Its editor, Samuel McClure, shared many of the same inclinations as his author, Turner. McClure's upbringing, steeped in evangelicalism, abolitionism, and temperance, all profoundly Christian, suited him to both the reform-mindedness of muckrakers and the Christian-centered worldview of some reformers. So we can see that his impression of Jews is both religious and racial. In particular, he maligned Jewish women for becoming prostitutes. There has grown up, he went on, as an adjunct of this female herd of wretchedness, that's the women involved in sex work, a fraternity of fetid male vermin, nearly all of them being Russian or Polish Jews, who are unmatched for impudence and bestiality. In a later article, Turner, not McClure, narrated the connection between Jewishness and white slavery more specifically. Out of the racial slum of Europe has come for unnumbered years the Jewish pimp leading the miserable Jewish girl from European civilization. He comes out of Galicia and Russian Poland with his white hair and long beard, the badge of his ancient faith, and wanders across the face of the earth. Turner linked the trope of the wandering Jew with the deviant sexualizing of the old white-bearded Jewish man and the young, miserable Jewish girl. The man's Jewishness was both racial, out of the racial slum, he says, and religious, his beard, his ancient faith, categories which Turner's account blended seamlessly. Similarly, in the 1910 Fighting the Traffic in Young Girls, or The War on White Slave Trade, Ernest Bell, this is the slide that you see here, claimed that Jew traders were importing and installing Polish Jewesses and any others who will make money for them. He called on the whole Christian conscience to save us from the importation of this foreign pollution, which is already corrupting the manhood and youth of every large city in this nation. Both Jewish men and women demonstrated deviance in Bell's picture. Jewish men simply wanted to profit from sex, even if it meant selling their women, and Jewish women corrupted American manhood. Yet he didn't think this of all immigrant groups. For example, he wrote, "The Italian, unlike the Jew, rarely puts women of his own race into this awful life." He saw Jews as others, not merely because they were immigrants or racially other, but he did think of them as racially other for sure, and he also sees them as religiously different. It's no coincidence that the cover of Bell's book depicted a white Christian woman in a flowing dress behind bars praying, "My God, if only I could get out of here." It's important to know that these anti-Semitic ideas were certainly not shared by all. Jews and many non-Jews thought it was ridiculous to blame Jews in particular for prostitution or other social ills. But the voices like Bell and Turner were certainly out there, and some people listened. Even their white slavery discourses, however, assumed that Jews were white. And it also cast them as other, even sometimes racially other, although certainly also religiously other on the US scene. So what does the past have to do with today? Today, I would say, we still have a complicated relationship with respect to Jews and race. I'd like to start out with a little thought experiment about what is different now from the time of the panic over white slavery and the rabbis who answered the US Immigration Commission's question. And also, what's the same? I'll suggest several differences and then three things that are perhaps surprisingly the same. A lot of these differences will be fairly obvious to you, so I'll go through this part relatively quickly. First, our ideas about race have changed. We no longer measure people's skulls, and all but a small slice of US society, at least nominally, would say the different races should be equal. Second, not only have our ideas about race changed, but the horrors of the Holocaust meant that talk of a Jewish race took on a particularly negative light. Few pulpit rabbis today would, like many of those rabbis who responded to the Immigration Commission in 1911, talk about the Jewish race with that phrase. Third, a growing slice of American Jewry is made up of Jews of color. This is from one particular study that other people said overestimated how many Jews of color there were in the US. There's been a lot of conversation and even some controversy about what these numbers actually are. So somebody else said, no, this study is totally wrong. It's more like 6%. A more recent Pew poll said it's more like 9%. What all of these people, even when they want to disagree with one another, can agree on is that the percentage and the number of Jews of color in the US is growing. And so this means a renewed conversation within Jewish communities. And this time it includes questions of racial justice, what it means to include people of diverse races under the umbrella of Judaism. One impulse can be, and I've heard this a few times, to say, well, Jews are multiracial and therefore we don't need to think about whiteness. But of course, that's not really sufficient. Jews are multiracial, but that doesn't protect Jews from white supremacists who think they aren't, nor does it mean that the Jews who are white never benefit from being white. So the increase in visibility of Jews of color can mean, and in many cases it has meant, more conversation about race, but it doesn't really mean that questions about Jews and whiteness have been solved or settled. In the US, it's true that the number of Jews of color will grow, but it's also true that the majority of people who identify as Jewish in the US are still white. So those are some differences that we see from the early 20th century. Not that there were no Jews of color, there certainly were, but today they're being increasingly recognized as such and talked about this way within Jewish communities. So now I want to turn to some of the things that are continuous, and some of them perhaps surprising. The first one is the idea that an appeal to law will somehow provide clarity or closure on the ideas about Jews and race. People in the US, both Jewish and non-Jewish, still appeal to law as if it can help clear up these questions. You could see this conversation around Donald Trump's Combating Anti-Semitism executive order on December 12th, 2019. Here's the crux of that order. Discrimination against Jews may give rise to a Title VI violation when the discrimination is based on an individual's race, color, or national origin. Some people got up in arms saying Trump had defined Jews as a race or nation. The order doesn't exactly do this. Others thought it was a good way to stifle anti-Semitism, especially on, say, college campuses because they could receive federal funding. And some saw it as designed to reduce anti-Israel or pro-Palestinian speech and action. Whether this particular executive order was good or bad, or useful or not useful, I have my own opinions and I expect you do too. But my point here is to note that the Jewish public generally assumed that it was really important because it was a legal statement. In the end, though, I think it was much more a reflection of cultural and politicized ideas of Jewishness in relationship to race than it was a change or an installation or the beginning of those same ideas about Jewishness in relationship to race. It did very little, in fact, and it certainly did not unambiguously make Jews into a race or a nation. Responses to the executive order also showed how the law was not really up to the task of defining Jewish difference with respect to race or really anything else. The Anti-Defamation League CEO Jonathan Greenblatt told NPR, "There is something we have long advocated for and does not break new ground in identifying Jews as a protective class. But what it does say is that discrimination against Jews may give rise to a Title VI violation when that discrimination is based on the individual's race, color, or national origin. So if you listen closely, you can see him doing this little dance. Jews aren't really a race, he implies, but they should be legally protected against racial discrimination. There is a strong legal precedent for that dance too. A 1987 Supreme Court case, Shari Tefillah v. Cobb, took up the question of whether a Jewish congregation could be protected under the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The unanimous court decision read, "The Jewish people most certainly suffered such discrimination and were not barred from their claim simply because they, like the defendants, were Caucasian." So you notice that in that unanimous Supreme Court decision, the court says, yes, they can be protected, but also Jews are Caucasian. You might expect that their reasoning would be something like this. The young men who spray painted the anti-Semitic graffiti on the synagogue, that's Shari Tefillah, thought that Jews were a separate race, and therefore these young men were doing racism. They were being racist. They were doing racist acts because they thought that Jews were race. And in fact, that's what the lawyer representing the synagogue argued. She would say what really matters when someone discriminates Jews is, quote, if they view them as racially distinct, then conduct should be covered. But actually, that's not what the court decided. The court ruled that the Civil Rights Act of 1866 could be applied here, but it was because, quote, Jews constituted a group of people that Congress intended to protect. It is evident, they wrote, that Jews and Arabs were among the people then considered to be distinct races. So I would say it's not nearly as evident as the court claims that Congress meant to protect Jews when the statute was passed. 1866 is not the same thing as the early 20th century, and it's not clear to me that was part of Congress's intention. But that's a historical argument, and between us, the court has a long history of being selective with its historical narratives. But more importantly for our purposes, the court calls the Jews in question, a synagogue with almost all white members, Caucasian. To sum up, the court says these Jews are white now, they wouldn't have been white in the past, and they're also now entitled to protection from racial discrimination. Throughout these conversations, you can see a hope, even an expectation from both Jewish communities and others, that legal definitions or statutes are going to provide certainty or closure. But we can also see how that just doesn't happen. Even if they were unambiguous, legal definitions can't transform cultural ideas overnight. The legal ambiguity around Jews and race isn't what's generating questions about Jews and race. It's reflecting them, sometimes amplifying them, but the law isn't providing any true clarity or definitive answers. So the second continuity, if the first continuity was people turn to law, but it doesn't actually provide clarity or closure, the second one is we again see these appeals to science. And as you'll probably guess, they too are not going to provide clarity or closure. Today, happily, we are not measuring people's skulls to determine racial hierarchies. We do, however, see appeals to DNA science to adjudicate who is Jewish. Like we can see this very specifically in Israel, but also in less clear ways in the US and Canada. I'll explain a little bit about what I mean here by referring to what the scholar Kim Tallbear calls gene talk. That's the idea that essential truths about identity inhere in sequences of DNA. And I'll draw on some ethnographic research that my colleague Hilary Kale and I worked on together. We found lots of examples of Jews having their DNA tested for a variety of reasons. We also found instances of people having their DNA tested and discovering they were Jewish or part Jewish. Some of these people even wanted to become part of Jewish communities. But we also saw that these claims to Jewishness were easier or better accepted for people who looked white. In fact, the appeal to science to understand Jewishness and race turns out to create more ambiguity and exclusion rather than certainty. There's a lot of gene talk within Jewish communities alongside an interest in genealogy. Some of this is motivated by learning about the losses of the Holocaust, but it's also motivated by interest in heritage and history. You can hear discussions of the so-called Cohen gene and percentages of Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry on direct-to-consumer DNA tests like 23andMe and others, alongside questions about Jewish hair and Jewish noses and how Jewish Nobel Prize winners are more likely than other groups. All this gene talk suggests that Jews have heritable characteristics that are sometimes physical and sometimes dispositional, and that they have tendencies that are particularly Jewish and not shared with other groups. And so many of those things begin to sound racial. And added to this, when Black or Asian Jews walk into American synagogues, for instance, they're often met with questions about their Jewishness. Similarly, the structure of Jewish DNA talk can conceal Sephardim and Mizrahim, Jewish populations with ancestry from the Middle East, North Africa, and the Mediterranean, from discussions of who is a Jew. Most of the genes that people call Jewish genes are actually markers that occur in higher frequency in Ashkenazi populations, not Sephardi or Mizrahi ones. The so-called breast cancer genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2, Tay-Sachs, Gauchers, and more than a dozen others that are sometimes referred to as Jewish genetic diseases, even though they only affect Ashkenazim and not Sephardim at higher rates than the general population. Ashkenazim make up the majority of North American Jews. And this kind of gene talk reinforces the idea that they're the only real Jews, or they're the center of Jewish life. Ashkenazi Jewish is, by the way, the only Jewish category that most DNA tests include. Both DNA tests themselves and the conversations around them suggest that Jewishness is at least race-like. And so this race-like undercurrent of gene talk marginalizes adoptees, converts, their descendants, and many others who find themselves written out of the Jewish people when Jewishness is so closely linked with genetics. So we could talk lots more about this, but in short, Jews and others have appealed to genetic sciences to seek clarity over exactly what Jewishness is and where to fit it in a racial landscape. But in the end, it does not provide a clear and precise picture of Jewishness. Continuity 3. If we're wondering, okay, how can we think better about Jews and race? And we think, okay, we know the answer is not going to be a simple legal answer or a simple scientific answer. I think question 3 helps us answer that. And that is that in today's US, like the early 20th century, Jews can still be both white and victims of white supremacy, which is not to say that all Jews are white, or even that all Jews are victims of white supremacy, but we can also see that Jews can be beneficiaries of systems of racial inequality. So before I get to this specifically, I want to talk about a related idea. That is, one thing we can do to think better here is to think more subtly about the relationship of anti-Semitism and racism. Jewish studies scholars had been relatively reluctant to think about anti-Semitism as a form of racism, although this is changing rapidly, especially in the last several years. Is anti-Semitism a form of racism? Is it racial discrimination or bias? Or is it something else? Here is the truth. Sometimes anti-Semitism is a form of racism, and sometimes it is not. Sometimes it's about both race and religion. Sometimes it's about only one. Sometimes it's about additional things too. So we want to think about racism carefully, and we can think about it as one possible component of anti-Semitism, but we wouldn't want to reduce anti-Semitism to racism. And we also wouldn't want to see every instance of anti-Semitism as an instance of racism. Even though some might be, we want to carefully discern which ones are and aren't. So returning to the disagreements I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, I think part of the confusion is this. A group doesn't have to be on only one side of a hierarchy or only one side of a power dynamic. You don't have to be either a victim or someone who benefits. You can sometimes be one and sometimes be the other. To say that white Jews experience the benefits of whiteness is not to say that those same people don't experience anti-Semitism or discrimination. They can, and they do. And as you've seen today, I think that's important. But I also think it's important to note that white Jews in the US have experiences that are demographically very similar to other whites. High levels of access to resources, including education, the possibility of intergenerational wealth, and secure housing, for example. When people talk about structural racism, it's usually these kinds of things they have in mind. They're looking demographically as a whole. And white Jews, as a demographic slice, as a whole, experience education, wealth, and housing like other white people. And that is to say, at relatively higher levels compared to many other demographic slices. Discrimination and bias against Jews exist, but it has not created a landscape that disadvantages Jews with respect to these categories. So Jews have benefited from American economic and educational systems. That means that white Jews have experienced the benefits of whiteness, even while they may also experience discrimination. The converse is also true. Having experienced discrimination does not make a person not white. Women, for example, experience discrimination as women. Gay men experience discrimination. So do trans people, so do Muslims. But we recognize that it's possible to be both white and a woman, both Muslim and white. And that means you can experience discrimination while also being white. So I think in the end, we have not really solved our paradox of what it means that many Jews can be white, but also experience racialized anti-Semitism. But I hope that now we can see that situation better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was really, really illuminating. I'm going to invite you to close your PowerPoint. That's great. Thank you so much. All right, so we already have a number of questions, so I'm just going to do my best to sort of group some of them. So some of the questions actually came in towards the beginning of your talk before you had gotten to the topics that they addressed, but I still think that in some cases they're worth revisiting. So one came in at the very start, and the audience member wrote this: I have an olive complexion, am ethnically Jewish, and used to be asked where I really come from. I have a grandfather from Azerbaijan. I now identify as Middle Eastern. Aren't Middle Easterners usually considered brown nowadays? Okay, so that was the question that came sort of before everything that you offered us.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of what you did for us helps understand this question. But I want to come back to it because I want to see if you can sort of put a point on it a little bit and connect with the notion that Mediterranean or Middle Eastern could have been a white race 100 years ago. But what about today, right? So what does whiteness in particular mean as opposed to what it meant then? And how do we think about specifically color or skin color in particular as the main marker of how we're thinking about differences between race? I mean, I think you've broken some of that down, but.
Yeah, and that's a great question. So part at the end, I talked a little bit about structural racism, which often has a little bit less to do with skin color, but we can see all sorts of interpersonal interactions, as this audience member notes, right? Interpersonal interactions that are much more about skin color, right? We can name things like interactions with police that clearly are about skin color because that's what's obvious. Like, but there are also, we would note, about things like neighborhoods, intergenerational wealth, education, occupation, things like that too. Yeah, so I think one thing to note is that when we say things like race is socially constructed, we don't mean that therefore it's not meaningful, but one of the features of social construction means that it can mean different things at different times. And there might be things that people want to connect with in their own heritage or not connect with in their own heritage. And I think we're seeing a moment where people are saying, oh, wow, the things that are part of my heritage that might have been thought of as different or not white are valuable, maybe are part of what make me who I am. And so it's interesting. And I wonder, this audience member, if she had lived 50 years ago might, for really important social reasons, wanted to think of herself and present herself as white, whereas now she might want to say, look, that would be flattening my own history and my own heritage. And here are the reasons that I might identify as Middle Eastern now. So I think that we do want to notice that there is that kind of change over time, and that some of it has to do with skin color, and some of it has to do with other things like heritage, and some of it has to do with economics and history. So I think one of the things that that example points to really nicely is how complex racial identification is. She's talking about her own racial identification, but then she's also talking about how people perceive her racial identification and what motivations she would have to connect with a certain racial identification are going to be different from the motivations that people have to see her in one way or in another way, right? I would guess that like many people, she's probably someone who is perceived differently in different environments. So there might be places where others assume that she's white and places where others assume she's not white, just depending on the social context too. So I think there are so many important dynamics at the level of the individual that I didn't even talk about today, right? Like this was about big discourses and Supreme Court cases, but of course this stuff matters in people's lives like a lot. And that was the thing I didn't get to talk much about today.
Absolutely. And actually that's reflected in a number of comments that are really more comments than questions, just people saying like, I used to think of myself this way, now I think of myself this way. One's own self-perceptions change over time and in conversation with social constructs, right? Yeah. In connection with that, we have a few people who are kind of thinking about this whole idea of what you call Jews, if it's a race or an ethnicity or a people. So a few people wrote in to say, to offer definitions to like for your feedback, right? So one person said, I've heard the Jewish people defined as a multi-ethnic, multi-racial people, not a racial group, nor solely a religion. So does that definition work for you? Someone else asked if Jewish peoplehood is a coherent way to understand the status of Jews. And several people wrote to say, does it make sense on forms where you're supposed to indicate your race? Does it make sense to check other and indicate white Jewish or something in the box?
Yeah, that's a great cluster of questions. I think as an empirical description, it's really useful to say Jews are a multiracial group of people, for sure. The thing is that doesn't tell us who Jews are versus who they're not, right? Like but it's a really good description of, yes, I think that it's right. And that means that Jews are not a singular racial group. They are a multiracial group, which goes to the question, okay, so when we fill out on our forms, I think that white Jews should check white on them. So European descent Jews should check white. I'm certainly not the police of that. And part of the reason that I think that is, and here, this is a little more like me wearing an ethicist hat as opposed to a historian hat, but I would say that is because of the ways that white Jews do experience the demographic similarities to other whites, right? That if what we're interested in those forms, which we often are, is something like racial equity, then I think it's because demographically white Jews really do match other whites and are sometimes even, do have more access to education, more intergenerational wealth, things like that, in spite of things like housing discrimination, which is a thing that you would point to as certainly a historical problem, like that's an anti-Semitism problem. So yes, I think given what those forms are usually asking for, I would check white. Like I said, I'm not the form police though, and people will have different ideas about how they self-identify. I do think that race is a challenging one because we do have a shared social sense that you can't just pick your race. Like Rachel Dolezal does not just get to declare she's Black. That makes lots of people angry, and very few people supported the like, oh, you can just choose your race. So we don't have a shared sense that you can pick your race. Even if we do have a shared sense that race is malleable, and if you're multiracial, you might identify with some parts of your ancestry more than others. So I do think that, yeah, anyway, that's a long way of saying that I think that white Jews generally should check white because that's what those forms are interested in usually they're interested demographically.
That's really, really helpful. I just want to say there are so many fascinating questions and comments coming through. I'm really sorry that we won't have time for me to get to all of them. One that I want to throw out and see if you have a quick answer is, can you articulate a difference between race and ethnicity?
That is a fabulous question. And the answer is basically no. Because they're both social constructs and they are overlapping, people will do them differently. Speaking of forms want to tell you that being Latinx is an ethnicity, but not a race. But if you fill out a different form, maybe Latinx is a race. So there's not a very strong scholarly consensus. In fact, this often gets talked about as race/ethnicity. So I think often people are using the word ethnicity to mean race, and they think that it's like a more delicate way of saying it. And sometimes they mean something else. But the short answer is no, I can't give you a great answer to that because I don't think that I've ever seen one that is useful and compelling and articulate.
Okay. I want to ask, there's a couple of things that I want to make sure we get to. One is the question of religion and how this all plays in, right? So a couple of questions have come in, like kind of clustering around this, and you can kind of pick which direction you want to go. But one is asking, would it be more accurate to change the term, to use the term white Christian supremacy instead of white supremacy? So like, how does religion play into the construct of whiteness? And then the other question that's come in a few times is, what about conversion? Like, how do we account for the fact that the Jewish body of people is in part made up of Jews by choice, and how does that connect to this sense of ethnicity, race, DNA?
Yeah. So I think the question of white Christian supremacy, I think in lots of cases, that's a really helpful term. In other cases, it's not quite right. I mean, some of the white supremacists are so white supremacists that they decided that Christianity was too Middle Eastern and therefore went for like Norse gods and things like that. And right. So we don't want to write those people out of our considerations of white supremacy. But I think that if we're thinking about what's kind of the dominant set of norms in the US, we would definitely want to think about Christianity, and we would be mistaken to say, oh, it's entirely about race, which has nothing to do with religion. The other thing I want to say about like, what do we do about converts? What do we do is that the idea that the Jewish people has always been closed and then like relatively recently became one where there were converts is nonsense. Like we have all of this evidence from antiquity that people move groups. What do we call those groups? Do we call them ethnic groups? Do we call them religious groups? Unclear, because those terms are shifting and they're modern terms that don't quite fit the ancient context. But it's not true that Jews have ever been a fully endogamous group. And so I think it's always been accurate to say that if there is a shared sense of lineage in the past, it's a shared narrative about lineage in the past, which is, is really, really important. But also it helps if we hang our hat on the idea that it's a shared narrative, because then everyone can be included in a narrative. Whereas what happens if we're like, look, we're doing DNA, uh-oh, you don't fit, right? Then we end up with these problems. But if we say we share this narrative of being together at Sinai, for example, then you aren't stuck with the racial problems that you get from either, say, law or science, where you can have a more expansive sense of who fits in the group, and then you're not stuck. I really do think you end up stuck with these like, oh, DNA gives you this basically racialist narrative of who Jews are, but that's not the narrative that actually matches on to who is in Jewish communities. So that's not a helpful way to talk about it. Like we need a different, and in fact, Jewish communities already have a different narrative. And so I would say, yes, let's lean on that shared historical story narrative more than we do DNA science to decide who's really part of us and who's not.
That maybe that is a great way to end. We may have to end there. I'll just say that there are a number of comments that are also pointing out, sort of in agreement with you, that race is a difficult, problematic way of talking about Jews and Jewish experiences, and it's also one that we can't really escape because of the ways in which race is embedded in our discourse today. So it's very helpful to have more tools for thinking through what it actually means and how we can use it to think about Jewish experience. So it's 1 o'clock. I am so sorry we have to end. I appreciate all the questions that came in, and I really appreciate this wonderful, clear, and helpful lecture that you've given, Sarah.
Thanks
Thank
so
you
much
so
for
much.
having me. It's really been a pleasure.